Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar. We will guide you to the conformity assessment principles this morning. I just would like to inform you that you are all muted this morning. By the way, my name is Elsa. I will be the webinar moderator this morning. You will all be muted, like I said. That means that you cannot speak out loud, but you can enter your questions in the question panel of the GoToWebinar. After the presentation, we will then have a look at your questions and we will answer your question if possible. Should your question remain unreplied, do not worry about that because we will upload the written answer on the website soon. Should you have a Twitter account, you can always tweet about the webinar, of course, via our handle is standards for EU. So let me introduce you the speakers of today. We have two speakers this morning. Stephanie Vering is responsible for accreditation and standardization at VDTUB. That's the Association of Technical Inspection Agencies. And my colleague Frédéric Dufour is project manager in the standardization and digital solutions in the section of mobility. So thank you very much for both of them. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will begin with the first bits of the presentation. A very warm welcome from my side. I do hope the audio is all right, and I would jump to the first slide directly. Our subject is conformity assessment, and that's also my expertise. So I'm very glad to meet here and link the conformity assessment issues and their realization and standards with the actual task of drafting these standards and editing them in an appropriate manner. What is conformity assessment? Well, to begin with, conformity is understood as the fulfillment of specified requirements. That's a convention we took to refer to conformity when it comes to rather technical requirements, and we use compliance with regards to legal provisions. So we're dealing here with what we call technical requirements, and the most important bit is that these requirements are specified somehow. And I think that's one of the motivations to gather here today, how to specify requirements in the right way, that the specified object could then be assessed for its conformity with these requirements. Requirements can be all sorts, can be from all sources, obviously, and I think that's the context in which we gather here today. Standards are a very convenient, very reliable, and very good source of requirements, but they could also be parts of bilateral contracts, legal provisions, or any other set of criteria. They could have different qualities, and that makes it a bit difficult when assessing. They can be very general. A typical question for a general requirement would be that whole installation is safe or user-friendly. More easy to assess and more easy to specify, but then more challenging to specify in the right way are detailed requirements, really exact and precise prescriptions. And I think that's the main content of what we would talk about today. Right. The conformity assessment is a task that is directed entirely at the question whether or not the object under assessment fulfills these requirements. So it's not a general check, it's not a characterization, analysis, anything, have a look at it, what do you think? Behind any conformity assessment stands the question whether or not conformity can be found, can be demonstrated or not. So with that, it's clear, unlike any other assessments in the general sense of that word, that the specified requirements will have to be there upfront. There's no development of requirements on the go. They have to be there. They have to be unambiguously specified before the assessment could begin with the gathering evidence whether or not the conformity can be stated. So in that regard, it's a specific assessment. It's not open with regard to the results. It's obviously open with regard to the question that the conformity cannot be found, but it's always a search for the answer regarding that question. The conformity assessment itself is, has a distinct choreography. I included that into the slides. I would go through that very briefly because I don't think that's too important for this context here. The individual steps of what is understood to be a conformity assessment activity might seem trivial. However, I can assure you they're not in daily life. The first step is called selection, and that relates to the fact that the conformity assessment is not a generalized characterization of your object, but it is actually the search for answers whether or not the object conforms. So you would have to select the points of interest, you would have to select the samples or the people to talk to, and that's a core part of the whole assessment. You then determine whether or not your selected samples or focus points you'd look at give evidence with regard to fulfillment of the requirement. You review, you conclude your results obtained with that perspective, and then you finally decide on whether or not the conformity can be stated. So the last bits are rather formal. Obviously, you attest that's mainly the motivation for many providers of objects to have the conformity assessed to receive the report, a statement, or a certificate. So having done that very, very briefly, I would focus rather on the objects that are subjected to conformity assessment, and that equals to these being the objects that are specified, these being the objects to which the standardized criteria, rules, provisions, specifications apply. On that list, you'd see on that slide are those terms used in the sort of guiding or background documents as the internal regulations are. Personally, I tend to refer to objects or item. To me, that's the easier way of concluding that whole spectrum of what can actually be assessed, because everything can actually be assessed. Even the conformity assessors can be assessed. I'll come to that later. But for the sake of completeness, these are the terms used in order to categorize the objects under potential conformity assessment. Hence, the objects to be specified, to be characterized by standards. A product is understood in the way ISO 9000 defines it, something that is produced, something that is an output of a process. A service, products can be tangible or intangible, so beware, it's not the thing you can have a grip on, but also software, for instance. The service is a special product that has an interface with the customer and is usually existing only at one point in time at that interface. So when dealing with assessment for conformity of a service, any surveillance is very difficult to realize because the service is then already delivered, and there's no no continuity in like in the tangible product world. A process, and that's very important, can also be an object of conformity assessment. And a process, again, understood in the way ISO 9000 sets these terms, is the transaction, a transformation from A to B, a transformation from input to output. Having these categories clear when drafting specifications around it helps a lot in order to shape and fulfill the drafting rules. A system is a bundle of processes, so interrelating, interacting activities, a more complex thing than a linear process or a fully finalized product. A management system is a specialized system with a goal. So a management system is not just a matrix or a bundle or well, array of processes, but the management system has some objectives to fulfill. And that is often found that the management system with its distinct objectives blends with the characteristics of objects or services that are provided within that management system. So understanding these individual categories helps a lot when having a look at texts and drafting requirements in a very orderly fashion according to the rules. A person is a natural person, a body is a legal person. That could be a group, that could be a unit of a larger entity, it can be a department, it can be even a public authority, it can be an organization, any sort of legal entity. A claim is the new kid on the block that's entering these terminologies, since it was found in the past years that a bit of information, a stated, a declared claim, doesn't really fit under the existing categories, and the means of assessing a claim for its fulfillment of requirements, for its trustworthiness or truthfulness, became, well, needed in the past years. So that's a new conformity assessment concept under development currently. So these are the building blocks of things that can be described by a standard. So I assume your daily work, your drafting work, your standardization projects would settle on one of these categories of objects. Once these objects are categorized and specified in an unambiguous and clear fashion, their conformity with these requirements, with these specifications, can then be assessed by anyone. And that's a very, very crucial and key principle, that anyone shall be able to assess this conformity. Anyone shall be able to cross-check whether the standardized, in your cases, the specified requirements are fulfilled by the individual object. When having a look at those who are assessing for conformity, we, for convenience reasons, think of three possibilities. And the first is called the first party. That is actually someone at the source of the object. That is someone who provides the service, that is assessed, someone who produces the product, that is assessed, someone who designs the process, that is assessed, someone really close to or at the source of the object. Second party is understood as someone who has a user interest in the object. So anyone who'd like to buy, who'd like to use, who'd like to collaborate with is understood to be a second party. Both can be rather sloppy when assessing because they're interested in the good results and give it an easy pass. Both can be extra critical because they're interested in delivering good products and maintaining their good name, or for instance, for a second party, they would be interested in a hard bargain. So there could be some, let's call it, bias or special interest with regard to the results of that assessment, with regard to whether or not the object conforms. The third party is thought to be free of any bias or any conflict of interest. The third party is thought to be independent, either of user interests or the provision of the object itself. So the job of a third party is the assessment only. They have no stakes whatsoever with regard to the outcome. When having a closer look at the assessment techniques, we distinguish basically, for the past decades, we distinguish basically 3 tools. As I said, for bits of information to be assessed and the entry of a claim being an object under assessment, a fourth, or if you so wish, fifth tool is entering that toolbox. And I'd go a bit into detail, but not too far. I just want you to have that heard. The classic conformity assessment tools are testing, inspecting, and certifying. Testing and inspection are tools that are applicable to all sorts of parties. So there are very well organized internal testing laboratories at a manufacturing site, for instance. There are second-party inspection organizations when it comes to bigger railway companies, for instance. And the third tool, the certification, is an exclusive third-party application. So one hint at well, your eagle eyes when drafting, there is no self-certification. Certification is exclusively a task undertaken by third-party conformity assessment bodies. The last 2, for the sake of completing that list, are called validation, verification, like testing and inspecting. All 3 parties can apply these assessment tools, and they are directed at claims. So the result of a validation or verification would be a confirmed claim. Those who apply these tools, the so-called conformity assessment bodies, are meant to apply these tools in a very organized and standardized fashion. So it comes as no surprise that even the conformity assessment itself, as it is standardized, the conformity assessment bodies are standardized themselves. You see here on the screen a list of the most relevant standards. They are all very generic. They are that generic that at that level even ISO and IEC joined to specify these assessment bodies. And they are reflecting the individual assessment tools, testing, inspection, and certification. The standards for certification bodies are categorized according to the objects under certification, since the certification of persons clearly is a different technique or requires different skills than the certification of a product. So for these individual, as for certification of management systems, so for these individual applications, there are individual standards, but these 17,000 series standards would standardize the requirements for the conformity assessment bodies. So there are no requirements in these standards to be found on how to assess, what to assess. It's rather how to organize the assessing body. The last line on that slide refers to one standard which comes in handy when the first party performs any assessment, the supplier or the manufacturer himself or herself, and their declaration of conformity has an own standard in order to have comparable and well, so standardized outcomes of this first party application when the conformity is assessed and stated and attested at the source itself, and not certified or assessed and demonstrated by rather independent means. So having this set of standards applying to the conformity assessment bodies themselves, it's obvious that they can be undertaken assessment as well in order to demonstrate that they are fulfilling their individual standards for their good operation, their competence, their impartiality, that is their neutrality with respect to the job, and some more sort of housekeeping issues. They would need stable finances, they would need an archive, some good things how to run a conformity assessment body. And once a conformity assessment body, whether a testing laboratory, certification body, inspection body, fulfills these requirements, they can be subjected to assessment themselves. And for the sake of not getting lost in terminology, the conformity assessment of the conformity assessment bodies is called accreditation. Accreditation would be the employment of a specialized accreditation body, specialized in assessing conformity assessment bodies for their setup and their stringency in being organized. That is one very convenient and straightforward approach, but once a conformity assessment body fulfills one of the 17,000 series standards, claims this fulfillment and has this checked, there are also other means of checking for that conformity of the conformity assessment bodies. It can be organized in a round circle of other conformity assessment bodies, visiting each other and checking the fulfillment of these requirements at the others' premises. And the third most classic option is the approval, the recognition, and the visit by a public authority. So any governmental approval would also be possible at the conformity assessment body's side, according to the specifications for the body realized in one of the ISO IEC 17,000 series. The idea is to build confidence in all of the results, build confidence in the competence of the body issuing the results, and allowing for ideally a free travel of either products, persons, bodies, or any other items without a double check. So like a product that could travel along with a valid certificate, which would go without a double check at the entry point, I don't know, the importing harbor or the buyer who intends to use that product. The recognition of the body issuing that certificate is one level of the quality assurance of this free pass, for instance, for products. And speaking of free passes for products and free travel, the European internal market is one very well organized example for products traveling freely. And in order to allow for that, the European internal market foresees specifications at each of the individual levels I just outlined. So there are clearly specified requirements for the individual objects, as there are specifications of the assessment procedures, as there are specifications for the assessing bodies. And at that point, the European internal market begins to make use of the international system. When it comes to the conformity assessment bodies, that is the set of specifications for the assessing bodies, they make use of the international ISO/IEC 17000 series. And even one level up, when it comes to the assessment of the assessment bodies, they make use of the internationally standardized and recognized accreditation system. However, it is up to the member states whether they would like to employ the accreditation tool as a means of recognition of these bodies, or else like to check for themselves by a public authority, for instance, or make use of a combination of it, that is requiring an accreditation by the local accreditation body plus an extra check by any public authority before submitting that individual conformity assessment body's name to the database of bodies that are recognized to perform this job within the European internal market, which is set up or which is organized according to the European new legislative framework. So the idea is not only to have free traveling products, but also to make use of a central database of conformity assessment bodies that are notified for performing this job, which means that they are checked for their competence, their ability, and their good organization at home, and then notified by their member state to be able to provide this service of conformity assessment all across Europe. So that's the idea of notified bodies within the European internal market, and the underlying structure, the underlying backbones and system of the ISO/IEC 17000 series, specifying accreditation bodies and specifying conformity assessment bodies. So that would be in one sweep the basics of conformity assessment, mentioning the keywords, mentioning the terminology that is used in this context. And I would now shift to the realization in standards drafting. The relevant, well, are these requirements as well in the internal regulation? The relevant text is found in the clause 33 in the internal regulations, which is, as you might know, as most of the internal regulations, part 3 is a mirror of the equivalent ISO IEC directive. So in this respect, the European Union didn't take a different route than the than the global approach. I would break down the requirements for drafting, the rules on how to get this on paper and to make work. I would break that down to 2 core principles to take at heart. And one, I personally usually call the separation principle. Nobody else does that, but to me it makes completely sense. And it says that the requirements that are standardized, the requirements that are specified, shall be separated from each other once they apply to different objects. That's the idea behind. I didn't go into the case that the requirements shall be requirements. I reckon that all of you, being good standards writers, would know that a nice to have, or it would be good if you wording would be very difficult to be clearly checked for fulfillment and hence conformity. So I treat that as a given that we're talking requirements here, that is really hard specifications. And once they are addressing different objects, they shall be separate from each other. That's the basic. The most important thing is to separate the specification, the characterization of the object from the assessment bit. That is, to begin with, from the procedure to use in order to assess, and that is, and that's more stringent, separate from the party, the body, the person, the unit, the entity who is assessing for conformity. So as I said earlier, you do have these categories of objects and you layer on the approaches of how to assess these objects for their conformity and who does that and by which means and by which recognition. These can all be thought as layers, as different aspects of the whole setup. And the idea is to have firewalls in between each layer. And firewalls realized in drafting, for instance, would be a different document. So that would be the separation object. I do hope the motivation is clear. The idea is that you can take that one specification and you can check that one object by one procedure, one approach for its conformity, and you wouldn't need to deal with a blend of objects and a blend of approaches, and hence an employment of even more than one conformity assessment body. The next very, very key and perhaps more famous principle of the internal regulations is called the neutrality principle. And the idea behind that, and that is also very much helped by separating the requirements, is to allow for anyone to assess the conformity. It's to allow for anyone to check the specified requirements with the object under assessment for fulfillment. And this refers particularly to that distinction made between first, second, and third parties. So the idea is that the requirements for the object itself shall be written in a way that either the manufacturer itself, the service provider itself, the designer himself, either the anyone at the source of the object, or else a specialized professional independent third-party testing body or assessment body shall be able to apply these requirements. That's the way in which they shall be written. That means if the separation principle is respected, that's already dealt with. If you specify the object separate from the assessment procedure or even the assessing body who applies this procedure, the neutrality principle is not violated, it's respected. So I spoke of layers, I spoke of individual elements, and I do hope that you can picture these individual layers of type of requirements, of type of objects and entities they apply to. Documents or applications that are mixing or combining these applications still exist. So that separation principle, even if taken to heart and realized in daily life drafting, can also benefit from an overarching scheme document, an overarching program. That's the term we use in that context, combining, for instance, the assessment procedure with the frequency of assessing or particular competence requirements for the assessing body. All of that is very useful, obviously, and by no means forbidden, but it has to be understood that these elements are not to be mixed with the individual original requirements for the object itself. So the whole assessment approach, everything that comes with the assessment, in case it's standardized, in case it's combined even, shall by no means be mixed with the requirements for the object itself. So the term in that context would be scheme or program. And whenever there are elements of schemes or programs to be standardized or drafted, they shall be separate. So the next slide would underline that concept. Do you want to come in?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that here we're going to talk about do's and don'ts. And as a CCMC editor, I am bound to say that I learned more. When I edited text, I learned more through don'ts than with do's. But anyway, please let me outline first that test methods shall simply outline the process and thresholds of testing, and not include provisions on who should undertake the test or establish conformity assessment structure within the testing. And also, you have to know that there is a clear distinction between the standards that contain specifications for a product, for a management system, for a personnel, and so on, and on the other side, documents setting down the operating procedures for a sector and specific conformity assessment scheme. And so, please let me, please, Stephanie, could you introduce the role of CENELEC TC1?
Yes. CENELEC TC1 is the mirror committee to the ISO IEC committee that deals with conformity assessment. So at that point, I start with the ISO committee first. The abbreviation is CASCO, so you might have heard CASCO documents or CASCO tools or CASCO requirements. That's the ISO IEC Committee for Conformity Assessment. And what they draft are the requirements for conformity assessment. That is, at their very core of their work, the requirements for the conformity assessment bodies, but also the requirements for the accreditation bodies. They do have an internal unit at the Central Secretariat at ISO that consults with technical committees who are interested in drafting schemes. So that is sort of leaving that level where the individual objects are specified and drafting a more complex application of their assessment. And so ISO CASCO also has a look at these not really horizontal, but more umbrella or framework applications of conformity assessment approaches for an individual task. And the CENELEC TC1 is at a TC level, so that is really the members are really national standardization bodies representing the member bodies. The CENELEC TC mirrors that ISO CASCO work. And at the same time, as I said, the European Internal Market and the Commission make use of the CASCO toolbox and the ISO IEC 17000 series when it comes to conformity assessment and accreditation. So CENELEC TC1 has also the role of a link between the standardization world and the Commission wherever conformity assessment issues are intended to be implemented. On the level of the real implementation, the actual TCs come into play. That's where the harmonized standards are drafted, where the mandates are realized, where the individual specifications for an individual directive, for instance, or regulation are drafted. But at the level of what conformity assessment tool to employ, for instance, CENELEC TC1 consults also with or links the standardization world with the Commission. So that's their main task. However, they do have real issues of real drafting problems, of real links with conformity assessment issues in what we call technical standards at the table, and so they can't really close their eyes with regard to these realizations of their pure and hypothetical and really theoretical made-up system at that horizontal level. And that's part of the reasons why we gathered today in order to bridge that.
Yes. So please let me hold the floor now and point out that the internal regulations part 3 translates this requirement to a consultation of CENELEC JTC1 instead. And there is a derogation on CEN policy for the inclusion of conformity aspects precisely in relation to standardization requests. Now, please bear in mind that the internal regulations part 3 for CEN and CENELEC are precisely to be used to give some guidance to CENELEC TCs, and this is pretty much the type of expertise to be expected from CENELEC TC1. Please bear in mind also that you may find additional information on the BOSS website at the following address, Indeed, you will find in particular a guidance document regarding conformity assessments. As I said earlier on, as an editor, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. As I said just now, we learn more through don'ts than through do's. And so now I'm going to show you 5 different examples of don'ts in ENs, precisely stuff that that as an editor I occasionally find in ENs or in CENELEC deliverables, but that shouldn't be there. And so, for instance, here you have a clause 21 called third-party inspection. The sprinkler system shall be periodically inspected at least once a year by a third party. Now, 5 seconds to let you guess what's wrong with this statement. And now the solution is that here you have a clear reference to a third-party inspection, and this is in clear conflict with the internal regulations part 3. So there are 2 options. Here, either the conformity assessment related aspect should be only contained in one separate document, or the verb shall, or rather the verbal expression shall be periodically inspected, should be replaced. In any way, the requirement expressed with the verb shall isn't to be kept. The idea is that the actions are such and such action are to be separated according to this or that party. Second example, here you have an Annex H normative, and you have a nice sentence saying the test installations forming the circuit comply with ISO IC 17025 accredited by a national standards body. Here, the problem is you have a clear reference to a national standards body, and this type of reference shouldn't be contained in one of our deliverables, as this isn't to be contained in an EN in the sense that it is the responsibility of the member states. So this is why this statement should be changed, and also because they do not accredit. And following example, sorry to bother you with so many examples, but they're so interesting. Now you have a clause 5.4 called guidance on the use of historical test data. This subclause starts with when undertaking extended application EXAP, and then you have further down, in applying these principles, the following conditions shall be met. EXAP is only undertaken by a notified body. You have to know that this comes from a standard about extended application rules for fire testing. And there should be no requirement for the test to be done only by a notified body. And indeed, in that respect, this is in conflict with the internal regulations part 3 as well. The following example is more tricky. Well, first you have to know that this comes from an Annex C, informative, called Provisions for Voluntary Involvement of Third Parties, C1 General. Now, please read the following statement and try to guess in what context this statement may become a problem. A manufacturer may employ third party or third parties for conformity assessment, which may involve a combination of type testing, inspection of factory production control, continuous surveillance, and auditing of the product. Now, you may think But hey, there's nothing wrong with that statement. But indeed, there is one context in which this type of statement, even with a may and even in an informative annex, may be a problem. And now I can give you the solution. The problem comes from the fact that this comes from a standard, which is, or which was, to be bound, to be harmonized under a regulation. To be precise, it was bound to be harmonized under the construction products regulation. Such an annex shouldn't contain in a harmonized EN, indeed, as this aspect is defined in the legislation. And now there are two different solutions to solve that problem. To change this statement. The first solution, which we talked at certain points during the present presentation, consisted in having a separate standard with the main provisions for third-party intervention of the main tasks applicable for the TC's standards. So pretty much create another deliverable whose content would be purely conformity assessment related. Another solution is simply to change the present statement, and instead of talking about a third party for conformity assessment, to replace it with another expression that could say, for instance, a competent impartial body, and then describing the qualities for which this body could be competent. And finally, not to give you nightmares about too many examples, the last and final, a subclause 10.2 called Assessment, Surveillance and Certification of Production Control. Now, please let me read it out to you, where it is required that the producer's production control shall be assessed and surveyed by an accredited inspection body and then certified by an accredited certification body. The provisions for assessment, surveillance, and certification given in Annex C apply. This comes from an EN about concrete, but you have to know that this clause requires a production control to be undertaken by accreditation inspection bodies, and that this production control is also to be certified by an accredited certification body. And then there's a series of technical provisions to be applied. But please bear in mind that these shouldn't be specific. And ideally, all the provisions should be found in a separate standard, which could be referred to, for instance, in a footnote. In other words, that whole statement here causes a problem because it is in complete contradiction with the neutrality principle.